The Lord, he thought he'd make a man. He made him out of mud and sand.
Gonna rise again.
He thought he'd make a woman too.
Gonna rise again.
He didn't know exactly what to do.
Gonna rise again.
So he took a rib from Adam's son.
Gonna rise again.
And he made Miss Eve for to be his bride.
Gonna rise again.
He put them in a garden bed.
Gonna rise again.
He told them to eat whatever was there.
Gonna rise again.
But one place they dare not go.
Gonna rise
Oh, that's where them big apples grow.
Gonna rise again.
Now old Miss Eve, she went a walking round.
Gonna rise again.
She see them trees all loaded down.
Gonna rise again.
Along come a snake, he was 6'3".
Gonna rise again.
Old Eve, she went a running right up the tree.
Gonna rise
Now that snake, he was coiling round the trunk.
again. Gonna rise again.
At me see his eyes, he wunk.
Them bones gonna rise again.
Old Eve went further up the tree.
Rise.
She sunk her teeth, oh boy, whoopee!
Bones gonna rise again.
I knowed it, indeed I knowed it, I knowed it, wee!
Them bones gonna rise again.
Now the Lord, he come a snooping
Bones
round.
gonna rise again.
He seen them peelings on the ground.
Bones gonna rise again.
Adam, Adam, where art thou?
Them bones gonna rise again.
Here's a master Lord, I come in now.
Them bones gonna rise again.
You've been eating my apples, I believe.
Them bones gonna rise again.
Those the master Lord is the woods is.
Them bones gonna rise again.
I knowed it, yes, indeed I knowed it, I knowed it, wee!
Them bones gonna rise again.
Now the Lord, he rose up in his
Bones
wrath.
gonna rise again.
He told him to beat it right down the path.
Bones gonna rise.
Yes, they grow out candy's hand.
Bones gonna rise again.
First the little lady and then the man.
Bones gonna rise again.
Oh, poor old Adam, he's holding the sack.
Them bones gonna rise.
Child, I bet he wish he had that old real back.
Them bones gonna rise again.
I knowed it, yes, indeed I knowed it, I knowed it, wee!
Them bones gonna rise again.
Now of this tale there am no
Bones gonna
more.
rise again.
'Cause I'm the pretty girl that ain't to come.
Bones gonna rise again.
I knowed it, yes, indeed I knowed it, I knowed it, wee! Them bones, they gonna rise again.
Bones gonna rise again. Bones gonna rise again. Bones gonna rise again. Them bones gonna rise again. Them bones gonna rise again. Them bones gonna rise again.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. true believers. Still I'm a long way, a long way, a long way, a long way from home.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Corey Pisciniak, the pastor of Mary Magdalene Apostle Catholic Community here in San Diego, and it's my joy and privilege to welcome you to our gathering this morning. Before we begin, we have a few technical reminders. For the best experience for all, we ask that you remain muted for the presentation. You'll be allowed to unmute yourself and ask questions during the Q&A time. You can also ask questions in the chat or by using the raise hand feature located under the reactions button. There will be a short break in the middle of the presentation to get another cup of coffee, use the restroom, anything you need to do. So once again, we thank you all for joining us today. We're fortunate enough to gather here to learn about the lives and spiritualities of 4 Black American women who are on the road to canonization: Henriette DeLille, Mary Elizabeth, Julia Greeley, and Thea Bowman. And our presenter for this morning will be Oliva Espin. Oliva Espin is Professor Emerita in the Department of Women's Studies at San Diego State University and the California School of Professional Psychology of Alliant International University. Dr. Espin was a pioneer in the practice of and theory of feminist psychology and psychotherapy with women from different cultural backgrounds, for which she has received multiple awards. Throughout her career, Dr. Espin has taught psychology of women, the psychology of immigrants and refugees, women saints, and other topics. She has presented at national and international conferences and published several articles and books on psychology and psychotherapy of Latinas, women immigrants and refugees, women's sexuality, language and therapy with fluent bilinguals, historical memory and memoir, feminist and psychological understandings of the lives and writings of women saints. Her most recent books are Women's Sainthood and Power, A Feminist Psychology of Cultural Constructions, and My Native Land is Memory, Stories of a Cuban Childhood, which won the 2021 San Diego Book Award. Without further ado, I'd like you to join me in welcoming Oliva Espin, our presenter for today.
Hello all. It's good to see you all. Let me start doing the share screen here. And 1 second, it's gonna take me 1 second to get to that. Okay. Okay, what? Huh. Okay. Okay, I don't know what's happening now. Let me just. I'm not getting the share screen for some reason. I don't understand why. So let me try again. Here. Okay. Well, hello everybody. I understand that there are, okay, we should be sharing now. Aha, can you all see my screen?
There we go. Perfect, Oliva.
Perfect. Okay, I don't know why I was getting it. Okay. So I will not be able to see your hands or be able to read the chat at the same time that I'm trying to do this presentation. So I don't know if, Corey, do you want to monitor that?
I'll take care of that.
Okay.
Do you want me
great.
to interrupt you with questions or hold them?
Let's wait until the end, sort of accumulate, because then it would sort of interrupt my flow. Okay, so welcome to all of you. I'm very glad you're all here, and we're on for what I hope would be something that would get your curiosity. As you were coming in, we were hearing the voice of Sister Thea Bowman singing, and she is one of the women we're going to be talking about today. So let's start with, I know this is, okay. This is me, you know who I am, here I am, but the reason why this is interesting is my webpage and my email are there. If you have any questions, feel free to email me about this. And I will also put the email address again at the end in case you need to look at it. As Corey said, I've been a professor for a number of years, and now I enjoy doing these kinds of more or less informal presentations. And as you can see, these are my latest, the 3 latest books I've written. This is the one, The Women, Sainthood, and Power, where I'm writing about saints, and the content of what we're talking about today is related to that book, which is now thankfully in paperback after a time when it was outrageously expensive, but now it's in paperback, and all my books are in Amazon. So if you're interested, it's possible to get them. Okay. And I saw these and I couldn't resist because we're all on Zoom, and here's poor Moses trying to talk to God who may be on mute, and I'm sure this is an experience we all have had. So okay, there you go. That's the joke of the day. Okay, so let's start by talking about Blacks and other non-European Catholics in the US. And the most important point I want to bring across is that even though there were Catholics in what today is the territory of the United States, even before the Pilgrims arrived, to this day, most people assume that US Catholics are descendants of European immigrants from the 19th and 20th century. And we will see that in a number of different things that we are encountering. The first permanent settlement in what today is the territory of the United States was not in Massachusetts. It was in Florida. It was St. Augustine, and you can see on the right the modern map of where it is, and on the left an old map of where it was. So this area here and this area here are the same thing, represented in different ways. And this settlement was founded in 1565. So it was actually not quite a century, but certainly about 80 years before there was anyone in Massachusetts or in the Northeast of the US. And because this was Spanish territory, the inhabitants in this place were Catholic. And for a number of years, in fact, a number of centuries, for a couple of centuries, Florida was a place where runaway slaves from the South went, because they were better received than it was the territory of the Southern US. So there were large Catholic populations that were non-white, Blacks, indigenous populations, mixed race persons in all of these areas. First of all, Florida again, which had a very story of coming and going from who owned Florida. As I said, Spanish in 1565 when it was settled. But then after the 7 Years' War, which was, which in the States is called the French Indian War, this is actually somewhat funny and unknown, but of course very important for me. The British took Havana and controlled Havana for a year, and the Spanish government wanted to get Havana so much, wanted to get it back, that they exchanged the whole territory of what today is the state of Florida for just the city of Havana in 1783. So then it came to the US when it was now US, not British anymore. Well, okay, so that was it, 1763. The Spanish took it over again in 1783. Then in 1819, it came to the States, and in 1845, it became the 27th state. So Florida has this a story of coming and going between Spanish, Latino population and the US or British population. There's also, of course, the Louisiana, which is an enormous French territory that was bought by Jefferson from France, from Napoleon in 1803. And then Texas, Arizona, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, parts of Colorado, and Wyoming were Mexican territory that was acquired by the US between 1836 and 1848. And the populations in those areas was mostly a Catholic population. This is a map that sort of tells you the same thing. These are the original territory that was connected with the first 13 states. You can see this is this part, but look at the rest of the US. And Florida, this is the big Louisiana territory that I talked about. Texas, that had its own particular story, and all this area that was gathered during the Mexican War. And then there were other areas that were ceded or bought or etc. in different kinds of treaties. And of course, down here, it's Mexico and Cuba, which it's very close here. Okay, so this area, basically, except for this brown area here, the rest of this area was mostly Catholic populations. So thinking that Catholics are only descendants of white Europeans misses the point. But of course, you know, there was something coming and going here also, in that Catholics were considered not to be good enough to be American citizens. And those of you who are old enough may remember that even during the 1960 election, there was some claim that if John Kennedy became president, the Pope was to govern the US. So of course, we did not want Catholics. And at some point in the 19th century, there was very strong hostility, like burning schools and burning churches and etc. So that's why it sort of becomes more what we think about Catholics, but it's not where the Catholic population started in the US. And as I said, Florida in particular became an area where runaway slaves from the South looked for protection. Okay, so when we're talking about slavery and the Catholic Church, there's a very uneven picture that we have. On the one hand, there were a number of the European immigrants and European clergy, which basically clergy was European at that time, were very ambivalent about slavery. Some congregations owned slaves, and it was very hard to sort of disengage from this. On the other hand, something that was very interesting, and it's something in which a contrast between the British and the Spanish Empire and the French, for that matter, is that marriages between people of different races, be it indigenous, Native Americans, or Blacks, the church, the Catholic Church, officially went in favor of those marriages. Where most of the Protestant denominations, certainly at the time and until recently, were against the idea of interracial marriage. So on the one hand, they're owning slaves. On the other hand, they think that slaves and white people, or free Blacks and white people, should marry. And of course, what the church is saying, we don't want them to live in sin. So it's important that marriages are legitimate and blessed by the church, and etc. So on the other hand, there were a number of bishops who said very strange and contradictory things, and in fact told about the importance of baptizing slaves and yet telling the slaves that they should obey their masters. And so it was a very ambivalent position. And of course, a lot of it depended on who the particular bishop was and what his particular beliefs and understandings, etc., were. And at some point, even when they are saying that Blacks deserve good treatment, they are also saying, because these poor people who are all ignorant and this and that and the other deserve our attention. So there's a, as I said, a sort of ambiguous place there. At the same time, there are a number of Black Catholics that were very strong in the 19th and the early 20th century, very important people. We don't have time to go into it, but if you want to learn more about all this, Cyprian Davis has a history of Black Catholics in the US that is worth reading, although it stops in 1990, which is when the book was published. And there's a lot that has happened after that, including these people who are going up for canonization. But again, there's much more to say about this. I just don't have time to get into it. Okay, so why are we talking about saints? Why are saints important in any way? I mean, for some people, okay, saints are important because of devotional kinds of things. You know, we pray to saints and they protect us, or they are. The idea is that we have to look at them as role models more than as miracle workers. That's, you know, the present day understanding of saints is that they are sort of friends of God that can show us how to be good Christians. So why are saints important in terms of devotion? It's sort of pretty clear. But there's always another way in which saints are important, which is what I emphasize in my book on women saints. And it's that saints, far from being static icons, provide windows on events in the larger world around them and offer ways of charting change over time. And this is a quote from Jody Billinkoff, who's one of the editors of a book entitled Colonial Saints, that looks at saints in the Americas, North and South, during colonial times. And there's also a book that it's older, but also very interesting, from Donald Weinstein and Rudolph Bell, in which they say that the pursuit, as well as the perception of holiness, of what makes someone a saint, mirror social values and concerns. I think, you probably know that medieval women saints were supposed to self-torture their bodies, or saints in general were supposed to torture their bodies to prove how saintly they were. And now we are not talking about body torture. We are talking about behavior and other virtues and commitment to social justice and etc. So they mirror what we consider to be saintly people, mirror social values and concerns of the time. And so they say saints' lives shed light upon broader social issues and collective mentalities beyond whatever devotion you may have to some saints. Learning about them teaches what was going on in the time. And as I said, that's what my book emphasizes in relation to women. So what is canonization? I know those of you who are Catholic would say, well, I know, well, maybe yes, maybe no. So even if I'm repeating, I hope you excuse me if I'm repeating something you already say, but okay. So canonization in the Roman Catholic Church is the official declaration made by a pope that a deceased member of the church who has already been beatified, and I'll get to that in a moment, is indeed sharing in eternal glory and therefore can be considered a saint. Regardless of when we say in popular parlance, this person is a living saint, there are no living saints in terms of the Catholic Church. First condition is you have to be dead. And then the other condition is your life is examined by a bunch of experts who read everything you wrote, talk to people who knew you, investigate your impact in your world at that time. And you also have to, after death, be able to, or have shown to have performed miracles. And I'll get to that also in a moment. So it's a very long and expensive bureaucratic process that starts 5 years after a person's death. It used to be 50 years, but John Paul changed this. And he changed a lot of things in the canonization process. Now, canonization doesn't make the person go into heaven. It's not like that. It just sort of certifies that the person is near God, that the person is in heaven, whatever that means. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just telling you what the official definitions are. And so some authors say that what you need to be canonized is money and miracles. And that's one of the reasons why it's difficult to canonize lay people, because the money part, when you're a member of religious congregation, the congregation puts down the money and uses some of the members of the congregation to be, the persons who read the documents and prepare information and or do the interviews and etc. Which, if you are a lay person, there's not an organization that does that. So, okay. So, a miracle. What's a miracle? A miracle is an event unexplainable by normal circumstances. And it is now, since last century particularly, usually a sudden medical cure. You could maybe medieval times or before say, oh, the person is a saint because it wasn't raining and we prayed to this person and the rain started. That's a miracle. That doesn't work like that now. There is a panel of 5 medical doctors who independently have to certify that these persons who was cured because someone prayed to this person that it's supposed to be a saint, that this cure is unexplainable in medical terms. And that is how a miracle is decided. For example, this is just one I happen to know. When Edith Stein was up for canonization, a little 2-year-old girl swallowed a whole bottle of Tylenol. Her liver was destroyed. She was about to die. Her parents prayed to Edith Stein, and the girl recovered. And her doctor in Mass General in Boston was asked, do you think this was a miracle? And he was not a member of the panel. In fact, he said, well, you know, I'm Jewish. I don't know anything about miracles, but I don't know why this girl survived. And so it's that kind of not having an explanation for what the cure is that establishes a miracle. One miracle is required before the person is beatified, and one more miracle is required before the person is canonized, unless the person died a martyr's death, in which case no miracle is required for beatification. Okay, let's look at stages in the process of canonization. So somebody thinks that person X has lived a holy life and deserves to become recognized as a saint of the Catholic Church. Okay. They petition the bishop in the area where that person lived or died. And then the bishop decides, yes, it looks like these documents show that this person lived a holy life. And so the bishop requests that the Congregation for the Causes of Saints in Rome, in the Vatican, considers this person for canonization. At that point, once the congregation starts looking at the person's life, the person is given the title of servant of God. And we'll see in a moment that some of these women we're going to be talking about are servants of God. This indicates that an individual is on the first step toward possible canonization as a saint. Then the congregation looks at all the papers that have been presented in much more in depth. Someone is commissioned to do more interviews, gather more information, prepare a big, thick book that is called a position about the person. And the Pope then says, yes, these persons meet the requirements of extraordinary virtue, and we can call this person a venerable. And again, some of the people we're going to be talking about are considered venerables. This title is given to a deceased person who has attained a certain degree of sanctity. So yes, there's something about this person that definitely means this person is saintly, but this person has not been fully beatified or canonized. Okay. Then we're waiting for a miracle at this point. So the first two things, the first two titles have to do with a person's life, their virtues, what witnesses can say, what they can be found in their writings, etc. The last two are the ones that require miracles. And so blessed is the title bestowed on a person who has been beatified. It means, okay, there's a miracle that is attributed to this person that has been medically certified that there's no explanation for this sudden cure. So this person sort of has proven, quote unquote, that they have God's ear because they succeeded in helping in the cure of this person. If the person died a martyr's death, then there's no need for a miracle. Edith Stein was beatified without a first miracle because she had been killed by the Nazis. So her death was the death of a martyr. Last week or a couple of weeks ago, Francis beatified Titus Brandsma, who was he was from Holland, from the Netherlands, a Carmelite, and he also did some things against the Nazis, and he got himself executed for that reason, and because it was considered that it was his faithfulness to God that made him do that, he's considered a martyr. And it's a longer story, but that's the basis. And then a saint is a person who has been canonized, and I already told you what happens for a person to be canonized. And a second miracle is required. And even if you died a martyr's death and there was no miracle needed for beatification, you will definitely need a miracle to be canonized. Okay. And miracles, of course, are becoming more and more difficult to prove because medicine is getting better and better. So cures can be done almost miraculously by modern medicine. So it gets more difficult to find miracles. And for example, one of the women we're going to be talking about, Henriette de Lille, had several miracles. She's a venerable. She had several miracles attributed to her, and somehow they had not survived the inquiry about being miracles, about not being explainable by any progress in modern medicine or kind of treatment like that. So she's still waiting. And there was one recently, I think I heard from 2017, that maybe it's being sort of analyzed now and may be the miracle to get her beatified. Okay. So let's talk for a couple of minutes about North American saints. First of all, there are very few. There's hundreds of thousands of saints. There are very few North American saints, US and Canada. Mexico is North America geographically, but not culturally. So I'm just talking about Canadian and US saints. And if we focus, there are a few more Canadians, because of course there are a number of, particularly in Quebec, of missionaries, etc. So there are a few more Canadian saints. There are very few North American saints. And as you look at the list of the North American saints, and I have 2 slides about them, something we notice immediately is that except for Elizabeth Seton, and we'll see in a moment in the other slide, Catherine Drexel and Tecawitha, all these North American saints are in fact European missionaries. They're not born. And that goes for the Canadian saints also. Isaac Jogues, Goupil, and Jean de Lalande were in upstate New York and Canada. That territory was very porous at that time in the 17th century. And for a while, they were canonized in 1930. And for a while, there was an insistence that this should be the patron saints of all of North America. But in the States, most Catholics said, we want someone who was born here, not a French priest. So anyway, so that's where other canonizations happen. And something that is very interesting is that many of these, I would almost say most of this, are women, women who were in some sort of religious congregation. So I won't go through each one of them, but I remember as a child when in 1946, Pius XII canonized Mother Cabrini, who was an Italian missionary, but she became an American citizen. So she was considered the first US citizen, although she wasn't born here. And there was, I remember, a big noise made in 1946. I was a child, but I remember in the news and everywhere that there was now a saint from the US. Then Elizabeth Bailey Seton, who was the person who really started the Catholic school system in the US. Newman, who was a bishop. Philippine Duchesne, who was canonized by John Paul, although the Sisters of the Sacred Heart were not too intent on canonizing her at that time. And then Catherine Drexel, which is actually a very interesting person. She was very, very, very rich. And she devoted her life and her money to Indians, to indigenous populations, and to Blacks. And Xavier University, New Orleans, was created by a congregation of nuns she founded. And she actually paid for a big chunk of the education of Augustus Tolton, who's one of the African Americans who's up for canonization. Then there's Mother Theodore Guerin and Damien de Buster, Father Damien, who worked with the lepers in Hawaii, Mary Ann Cope, who also did that, and Kateri Tekakwitha. So Tekakwitha, Catherine was her baptismal name. Tekakwitha was an Indian name. It's not that it was her last name. Look at when she lived and when she was canonized. And that is an interesting thing that we'll see also in a moment. And then there was Junipero Serra, who there was a big to-do when he was canonized in 2015, because he had been one of the people in the missions in California. And here in San Diego, we have a bunch of things about Junipero Serra. And in Northern California, there's an interstate that it's called, has his name, etc. So it was a very controversial thing. Okay, so let's look at Tekakwitha, the Lily of the Mohawks. She was canonized in 2012, as I said. She lived between 1656 and 1680 at the time of the missionaries who were canonized in 1930, the French missionaries. She was born in upstate New York, what today is upstate New York, and died near Montreal. And these are sort of different representations of her. And then we also have the example of Saint Martin de Porres, who lived, again, looked at his life dates, 1579 to 1639 in Lima. He was a contemporary of Saint Rose of Lima, and Rose was canonized in 1671. The big difference, of course, is that Rose was white, supposedly, although some people in Peru had told me and seemed to believe very strongly that she had some indigenous blood, but theoretically outside, she was a white person. And he was beatified in 1837 by Gregory XVI, who happened to be the Pope who wrote an encyclical against slavery. And, you know, it wasn't, there were a number of things being done against slavery at the time. So it wasn't that Pope Gregory XVI was sort of very much in there at the very beginning of the struggle. But in any case, it was the first Pope who actively wrote against the slave trade. And so it's interesting that he was the one who canonized Martin de Porres, beatified. And then he was canonized by John the 23rd, who we know was very open to a number of different things. So it's interesting when we look at the Cahuitha and we look at Martin de Porres and their contemporaries, there's a trend for those who are of European descent, clearly get canonized, taken seriously faster than those who are Black or Indigenous. At this point, we have 6 people who are African American who are up for canonization. The 2 men that you can see at the 2 sides of this painting are on the right, Augustus Tolton, and on the left, Pierre Toussaint. We'll say a few things about them in a moment. And the 4 women we're going to be talking about from right to left are Henriette de Lille, Julia Greeley, Mother Mary Elizabeth Lange, and Thea Bowman, who again, we heard her voice when we were coming in. And this is the same different representation of the 6 of them. At this point, we're going to take a mini break. We're going to hear a South African choir, women's choir, singing. Please be back in 5 minutes or less. See you very soon. Okay. Corey, take it from here. Do I need to stop screening? I think I have to.
Yes, you need to stop sharing.
Okay, there it is. Okay.
It was grace that taught my heart to feel, and grace my fear relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour that I first believed. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Once was blind, but now I see. The Lord has promised good to me. His word, my hope, secure. And he will protect me now and forevermore, as long as life endures. Amen. Amazing grace, yeah, yeah, yeah. How sweet the sound that saved the rich like me. Utanda coaches, utanda luangi sindi soda miches, kantino musa wako chesuwan, luangi pili sanami, luangi sindi sanami ches, sengi abona, sengi abona. It's an amazing grace. It's an amazing grace. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved the rest. That saved
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm stuck in my screen, so I need to figure out what I'm doing here. I don't seem to be able to get out of here. Okay. Escape. Okay, here we are. Now let me go down to the share screen. Here, okay. Here we are. Share screen. As you can see, I'm not terribly technical. Okay. Now you can see it, right? Yes, okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So let's go back to slideshow. Slideshow, not current slide. Okay. Okay. Are you still seeing? Yes, I can see. Yeah, you're seeing it. Okay. So let me, by the way, are there any pressing questions right now that we sort of need to ask before I continue? Does somebody have something that they really need to ask, or else they are sort of distracted by the question? You may want to write it down if you have a question, but if you want to ask it now, this is your moment. Okay, I'm not hearing anybody, so okay.
Doesn't look like it, so I think you can go ahead, Oliva.
Look like, okay, so I'm starting then. Okay. Okay. So before I get to the women, let me do 1 second of the two guys who are now venerables, both of them. Pierre Toussaint was Haitian. He, and you will see, the French influence in terms of Catholics and canonization also when we get to the women. So he was Haitian, he was a slave. His family that owned him came to New York, pretty much running away from the disturbance in Haiti with the independence revolution, etc. And he was a hairdresser. So he continued to work as a hairdresser and in the service of his masters. And the guy, the male owner, died, and he continued supporting the wife, who was his owner, but he was the one who was supporting her with his work as a hairdresser. He did much more than that. Eventually, he made a considerable amount of money doing hairdressing, and he took care of orphans and did a number of other interesting things. Augustus Stolten is supposed to be the first Black priest from the United States. He was a slave when he was a child. His father first escaped, and his mother during the Civil War, and his mother then escaped with the children. And he wanted to become a priest. After the war, he went to school, and Catholic school, wanted to become a priest, and no seminary in the US would accept him because he was Black. And so he went to Rome to study for the priesthood. And it was, as I said, some of the money he used for that was Catherine Drexel's money. And when he was ordained, they assumed, or he assumed, some assumed that he was going to be sent to Africa. But he was sent to the States around the Chicago area, and that's where he was all his life. And he actually died very young. So he was a priest around that area. And if you remember what I said about the different degrees, Toussaint and Tolton are now both venerable, meaning there's a miracle, or they need to have a miracle to their name now to be beatified. And for those of you who are religious, you may be interested in praying to some of these people or all of them, and try to foster their cause of canonization. Okay. Let's go to the women, which is the core of what we are doing here. The four women we have are Henriette de Lille, Mary Elizabeth Lange, Thea Bowman, and Julia Greeley. And we are going to spend the rest of the hour pretty much talking to or about them. So, and we're going to do that in chronological order. So the first one we're going to be talking about is Mary Elizabeth Lange, who was actually, her name before becoming a nun was Elizabeth. She took the name Mary when she became a nun. We don't know the exact date of her birth, so there are different dates in terms of when she was born. What we know is that she was born in Cuba of Haitian parents. Same idea as Pierre Toussaint. Her family ran away from Haiti, but they went to, and they were not white like the owners of Toussaint. They were blacks, but they had apparently a good position financially in Haiti. So they left and they went to Cuba. So she was born in the same city where I was born, in Santiago de Cuba. It's not important in terms of her, but of course it's important for me. Anyway, so her family fled Haiti to Cuba. She was born around 86, 83, 84, around there. And when she was a child, or still a young person, she immigrated to the United States. We don't know exactly when, but around that time. And she was in different parts of the States, finally settled in Baltimore, that had a large population of French-speaking Caribbean refugees, immigrants, and many of whom had no schooling at the time. So she opened, with a few friends, the first Catholic school for children of color in 1818 in Baltimore. And she founded the Oblates of the Providence in 1829 with the help of a priest. This is the first African-American religious congregation. They exist to this day, and they have schools where they mostly work with children of color, particularly some do with girls of color. And I remember as a child in Cuba that there was a school of the Oblates specifically for middle-class Black girls. This is her photograph, and this was the habit that the nuns wore at the very beginning, of the 19th century. And on the right, it's a statue of her. And she created this congregation with 3 other young women of Haitian descent, with the help of Father Jacques Joubert, and who was a Sulpician priest, French priest, Sulpician. There had been another attempt at creating a congregation of Black sisters, because the white congregations did not, or the congregations of white women, I should say, did not accept women of color. So there had been an attempt at creating another congregation earlier by a Belgian priest. And again, you see the trend here. They tended to be French-speaking priests who were running away at the time, historically, from the French Revolution and its aftermath. And they had sort of 19th century French spirituality. And they were, for the most part, the confessors, the parish priests for the Haitian population. They were white European priests, but So there was one attempt by a Belgian priest to start a congregation of women, and it completely failed because the bishop did not support it in some other place, in Kentucky, I believe it was. But this one in Baltimore with Father Joubert did have the support of the bishop. So they started this congregation, which, as I said, is the first congregation of Black women, African American women. In this case, most of them, as I said, were Caribbean, but it was others also, Black Americans who were members of this congregation. This is a picture of the congregation, and as you can see, there she is. Okay. So what the congregation said was its mission is the Oblate Sisters of Providence are a religious society of virgins and widows of color. Their end is to consecrate themselves to God in a special manner, not only to sanctify themselves and thereby secure the greater glory of God, but also to work for the Christian education of colored children. Okay, so by 1860, all the Catholic school for colored children in Baltimore were taught by Oblate sisters. And during the 20th century, Oblate schools were founded in 15 states in the United States. And then in other countries, in some places in Central America, Belize in particular, and including Cuba, as I said, there was a school for girls there. Okay, then we go to Henriette Delille, who is the person who's closest to being beatified among these four women. This is the only photograph we have of Delille. We don't have any other pictures. We don't have practically any of her writings, anything. There's something somewhat mysterious that way, but we do know a lot about her. And Cyprian Davis, who wrote about Black Catholics in the US, wrote a biography specifically about her. And Sean Copeland, who's an African-American theologian, also has a little book about Henriette Delille that is based on the St. Mary's College Madeliva lectures. She gave the lecture a number of years ago, and she did it about Henriette Delille. And something else that is also very interesting is that Vanessa Williams, the actress, produced and acted in a film that I think was first aired in the Lifetime channel about the life of Henriette Delille. That it's somewhat distorted, the Hollywood films sort of do whatever they want about things, but it's interesting that Vanessa Williams wanted to do something on the life of Henriette Delille, where Vanessa Williams, plays the role of Henriette Delille. And it's a film from the early 90s and can be gotten in Netflix or one of those live streaming channels. Okay. So Delille was a free woman of color in New Orleans, what it was called Creole, and in Spanish is called Criollo, which is people who are descendants of Europeans, but natives of whatever the place is, in this case, New Orleans. It could have been Peru, it could have been Cuba, it could have been Mexico, any place in where they were Europeans and native or Black populations. And some of these people were white and some of these people were mixed blood. In the case of the Lil, she was born of a quadroon mother. Quadroon means she was a fourth Black. The mother was a fourth Black. And her father was a white Frenchman. They lived in a common law marriage known as plaçage, putting in some place, placed in some situation. The mother's father, so her grandfather was a Spaniard. Her father was French, her grandfather was a Spaniard. And they were middle class, they were practically white. She was an eighth Black. And one of the things I've never fully understood about the racial criteria in the US is that if you have a drop of black blood, you are Black. I mean, in a Latin American context, Henriette Delille or Vanessa Williams or Haley Berry would not have been considered Black. There were all sorts of shades in the population, and people were whatever they looked. And yes, you knew somebody had Black ancestry, but big deal. It's not the same as saying that there was no racism. There was and there is a lot of racism all over the world, including in Latin America. So it's not that there wasn't, but it has a different tone. It has a different way of dealing with things. So in the case of the parents of the Lil, on the one hand, it was this kind of thing that was done at the time in these common law marriages. But even if they had wanted to marry, they could not, because the law forbade interracial marriage in a way that was never forbidden in Latin America with Blacks or with indigenous population. So it's an interesting thing for me to look at her. And if you look at her picture, she really looks white. So whatever. It's just an interesting thing that doesn't have anything to do with sainthood, but it sort of tells us about where she was in the social stratification of the New Orleans society. She was born 20-some years after the Louisiana Territory became the US. So there was a strong push for Americanization of the New Orleans and the Louisiana population. A lot of the Louisiana population was rural, but New Orleans obviously was very urban. So, and there was a big effort at Americanization at that time. And of course, it's before the Civil War. She was trained by her mother in French literature, music, and dancing. She spoke French. I don't know if she spoke any English, but the interactions and etc. were basically French. Henriette was groomed to find a white, wealthy male partner to enter a plaçage relationship like her mother and her older sister. This was a union between white French or American men in extended relationships, common law marriages with free women of color. And it was frequent that the men later married white women after they were established financially. But despite that, they may have kept their relationship with the women in this common law marriage for the rest of their lives, even if they married somebody else. Now, Delille was drawn to a strong religious piety and resisted the life her mother had lived and wanted for her. So she refused plaçage. In 1827, at the age of 14, she was very well educated. As we said before, she began teaching in the local Catholic school. She wanted to become a nun, but no existing congregation would accept her. In 1835, her mother suffered a nervous breakdown, and the court declared her incompetent and granted Delille control of her mother's asset. And she took care of her mother And what she did with that money was established a little place of consecrated, pious lay women of color, recognized, unrecognized by the church, which she named Sisters of the Presentation of the Virgin Mary. The original members consisted of Delisle and other young Creole women, in particular her two friends, Juliette Godin and Josephine Charles. Godin had been also born in Cuba. There was a big traffic between New Orleans, Baltimore, so Black populations, mostly French speaking in the US, and Cuba, coming from Haiti or not. They cared, this group of women, for the sick, helped the poor, and instructed free and enslaved children and adults. And so they took into their homes some older women who needed more care than just visits, which one of them was Delil's mother. And this way, they opened the first Catholic home for the elderly. Actually, it's the first nursing home in the United States. And it's still in operation. It's called La Faune Nursing Home, something like that. So it's still there. So they created this in the process of taking care of their mothers and other elderly women. In 1837, this order she had created was officially recognized. And in 1842, they changed the name to Sisters of the Holy Family. I'm not clear why that happened. I read a bunch of different things, and it's not clear why they decided to change the name. The priest who worked with them was, I think, the one who created that. In the new name. In 1850, they moved to a larger house where they created a school for free girls and women of color. And the sisters did a lot of caring of the sick and the dying during the many yellow fever epidemics that struck New Orleans. She died of tuberculosis in 1862 at the age of 49 during the Civil War, when New Orleans was occupied by Union troops. And she didn't write much, but there were some things written about her. And the last line of her obituary from 1862 reads, "For the love of Jesus Christ, she had become the humble and devout servant of the slaves." Ironically, she owned a couple of slaves. It's something very strange. There was a law in New Orleans that if a slave was freed, they had to leave the city, and I think all of Louisiana, or else they would be enslaved again. And it may be that she was very attached to this woman who had been a slave in her family. And she decided that keeping her as a slave was a way of keeping her around, rather than having to throw her out in the world because she could not stay in New Orleans. That's a possibility. We don't know that. Okay. Her only recorded writing was in the inside cover of an 1836 prayer book. And she wrote, of course, in French, "I believe in God, I hope in God, I love God." So these are the three virtues: faith, hope, and charity. I believe in God, I hope God, I love God. And then I want to live and die for God. So this is sort of a statement of purpose in life. Something very interesting is that the bishop that succeeded, or who was when after she died, did not want, and even the bishop during her time, they sort of were very ambivalent about both these congregations of Black women. But this concrete case is about the Sisters of the Holy Family, in which at some point, he said, don't call yourselves sisters. Don't wear a habit. Go work as domestics like all black women should do. And eventually he changed his line. He changed his idea about this. But it was sort of very unpleasant. And the same was true for the Oblates, of trying to say, we are nuns, we are religious, we are not just servants pretending to be nuns. And you can imagine how hard that could be, right? Okay. So the Vatican opened the Little Schools for Canonization in 1988. She was declared venerable in 2010 by Benedict XVI, and several miracles have been attributed, but no miracle has been certified yet. The next person I want to talk about is Julia Greeley, who was born between 1833 and 1848. She was born a slave, and she didn't know when she had been born. We know she died in 1918, but it was unclear what when she was born. And this is the only photograph that exists of her, of one of the children she took care of. So she was born a slave in Hannibal, Missouri between 1833 and 1848. Again, she didn't know when. And she died in 1918. When she was 5, the slave master of her mother and her was whipping her mother, and in the course of beating her mother, whipped her right eye. It's a 5-year-old child, and left her half blind for the rest of her life. She was freed from slavery in 1865, and from then on, she worked as a housekeeper, a cook, a nanny for white families in Missouri, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and eventually went to Denver to work as a housemaid for the family of William Gilpin in the 1870s. He was the governor of Colorado. And she learned $10 to $12 per week doing people's laundry and scrubbing floors. So all her life, she worked as a servant. In 1880, she was baptized as a Catholic, and she became very devoted to the Sacred Heart, which is something that touches me very closely, because it's being devoted to the love of Jesus, to the love of God. She was known as Denver's Angel of Charity because of her aid to countless families in poverty. And she pulled the red wagon through the streets of Denver in the dark to bring coal, to bring groceries, and to needy families, both black and white. She went at night. She did this at night to spare white families who were ashamed to take charity from a poor black woman. So she was laid to rest in a cemetery in Denver, and her cause for canonization was opened in 2014 by the Bishop of Denver. She was a lay woman, so it's very interesting that the devotion to her was such that the bishop was interested in opening this case. And her remains were exhumed, transferred, and placed in Denver's cathedral, the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, in 2017. She is the only Catholic lay person in the history of Denver whose dead body lay in state in a Catholic church and was buried there in the cathedral. So this on the left is where she was buried in the cemetery, and you can see the iconic red wagon that she used to transport her goods. And this is the same photograph that we have of her. But now, instead of being in that tomb, she's here in this place in the cathedral in Denver, where her body is inside several of these things. And the diocese of Denver is very intent on sponsoring her canonization and moving her forward. These women all have websites devoted to their canonization, all of them. And the other two, they are, of course, sponsored by the respective religious order. But Julia Grilly is being sponsored by the Archbishop of Denver. So that's a very interesting thing. Again, she was a lay woman. And then we have to talk about Thea Bowman. Thea Bowman, you heard her voice when we first came. It was her voice that welcomed us with a number of spirituals. A lot of her ministry was about music, and she had a beautiful voice. So she's almost our contemporary. She died in 1990. So I assume most of us were alive when she was also, and we may have seen her. I remember seeing announcements like she's speaking here or singing there or that kind of thing in different places. Probably and it's a video in YouTube that it's most impressive. It's of her talking to the Catholic bishops, to the whole conference of Catholic bishops in 1989, shortly before she died. And she sang to start, sometimes I feel like a motherless child. And at the end, she made all the bishops sing with her, "We Shall Overcome." So it's an absolutely moving experience to see that video and what she said about at that time about what it meant to be a Black Catholic and how important it was that the church will take everything that was Black, not just that these people are baptized and therefore they should come sing European songs, that the African music, the ways of worshiping that are part of Black spirituality should be incorporated as a regular part of the church. So what about her life? Okay, she converted to Catholicism as an adolescent. She entered the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. She received a PhD. She founded an organization of Black sisters. She promoted Black culture and music in the church and died of cancer at 52. Recently, Georgetown, which I suppose you've heard, is trying to make amends for the slaves they owned and sold in the 19th century. Georgetown recently, like a couple of weeks ago, consecrated a chapel to her, or added her name to one of the chapels. And there was a very interesting panel talking about her. And there's a young woman who has just written a book that it's about to be published about Black nuns. And the title is Subversive Habits. And she talked about Thea dying young and Augustus Tolton dying young, about so many Black activists connected to the church or not, who die young because of all the physical damage that constant stress does to people. And there were other people talking, but that was one of the things that touched me deeply and most made me think about what we as a society do to young Black people. Okay, so Thea was the only child of middle-aged parents. Her father was a physician and her mother was a teacher. So they were middle-aged and they were also middle class. She was born and reared in Canton, Mississippi. She's almost exactly my contemporary. She was born a year and a half before me. And when she was baptized, she was given the name Bertha Elizabeth. And at an early age, she was very involved with her parents and other people on the enrichments of African American culture and spirituality, history, stories, songs, prayers, customs, traditions, etc. And that was very much part of who she was. As a child, in early adolescence, she converted to Catholicism, inspired by the sisters who taught her at school. And then she eventually joined the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration and was sent to La Crosse, Wisconsin. She was the only African-American member of her religious community. And she went through a number of things in that context. I've heard also indirectly that even to this day, some of her contemporaries thought that she was getting too much attention. Okay. So at her religious profession, she was named Sister Mary Thea, and Thea came from her own father's name. This is a picture of her dressed in African-American or African garb, singing. In 1978, after a number of years in Wisconsin, she returned home to Canton, to Mississippi, to care for her aging parents. And she, at that time, was appointed Director of Intercultural Affairs for the Diocese of Jackson, Mississippi. In this position, she continued to promote cultural awareness and sensitivity. And she was a founding faculty of the Institute of Black Catholic Studies at Xavier University. Remember, I said was founded by Catherine Drexel's congregation. In 1984, she faced a big challenge. Both her parents died and she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she continued her ministry. She vowed to live until I die and continue her rigorous schedule of speaking engagements. At some point, somebody said something about her dying, and she said something like, "I'm not dying, I'm shooting to the star." And if you do watch that YouTube video I mentioned about her talking to the bishops, you can see the illness in how thin and, she looks ill. And at the same time, there's so much energy and so much in her that you couldn't tell that this is a person who's dying. She said what she wanted inscribed on her tombstone, and it's there, is these words: "She tried." And this is a painting on her when she had no hair because of chemotherapy. Today, across the United States, there are schools and education foundation to assist needy students to attend Catholic universities. There are housing units for the poor and the elderly, and a health clinic for the marginalized that are named in her honor. And to that, we have to add the chapel in Georgetown. Their books, articles, resources, visual media productions, a stage play that have been created to document her life, spirituality, and ministry, and her profound spiritual impact. Most recently, I've learned there's a mass composed in her honor, but I don't know if it's performed by any group yet. So that's that. Okay, now it's time for comments and questions, and we have about a half hour left for that. So I'm gonna go back to the general, to the collective, the gallery, as they call it. But I want again to, as I said earlier, to put in my email and my website address. So you, if you want to copy and if you want to write to me after, that I'll be, and if I don't know you personally, please identify yourself as someone who was at this presentation. Okay, so I'm gonna turn off the screen share and I am going to go to gallery, full screen. Okay, full screen. Okay, there you go. Okay, so we have two screens, so I may not see everybody because of that, but I'm sure that Corey will be sort of looking. So raise your hand, put your, your little yellow hand from there, or just simply unmute yourself and start asking. I'm here.
The first question comes from Cheryl. It's in the chat. And it's, how much historically or recently are canonization efforts a way to get more tourism supporters to a particular parish or diocese?
That's interesting. In the Middle Ages, of course, going to relics was like the tourism of the Middle Ages. Going to visit saints, places, and etc. Not so much now, but still, is the Diocese of Denver interested in Julia Greeley because it would attract attention to them? It's hard to know what, everything is human, even though it may be spiritual. So it's hard to know what exact motivations are for anybody and everybody. All I can say, it's not the Middle Ages, so people don't sort of want to have relics of saints so they can attract tourists in the same way. But yes, it may be that it's good to know that you have a saint in your diocese, so that may be an interesting pool, so to speak, for your own group. So hard to tell. It's the answer. Yeah.
Mary Beth asks, I'm wondering if you are praying to several saints at the same time for a miracle and the miracle happens, how do we know to whom we attribute the miracle?
That's an interesting thing. Yes, of course. If your intention is to make sure that it promotes the cause of a particular saint, it will be better to pray to that particular saint rather than to everybody. If your intention is just to get something that you need, you may want to have as many advocates as possible. So and of course and that's not just these 6 saints or these 4 women, but it's we are attracted to some people more than we are attracted to others. Human beings are friends. We are attracted, those of us who pray, to some saints more than to others. Or even if we don't pray, there are some people that make more sense to us as deserving more attention than others. So yeah, I would go to whoever touches you more. So who touches me more? For me, of these four women, the two that touch me more, I don't know why, are Ariel Delille and Thea Bowman. That doesn't mean that the other two are anything wrong with them. It's just that whatever they did or said or didn't, or their actions or their words, or touches me in a different way. And that's a very personal thing. And, you know, we each also, I mean, music is very powerful, which is what we have been using some music here. It's so Thea Bowman had a very important tool in her voice. I'm a horrible singer, so that's not what attracts me to her. But the music touches me in a very unique way. And I don't know about you, but the same way that some romantic songs, some hymns, or some religious music, or these spirituals touch me emotionally in a way that conversations don't do it. So again, it depends on how and what moves people. It's hard to determine that. More questions.
Sharon asks that maybe you said, but what is the current status for the canonization process of Thea Bowman?
She is a servant of God. She has not been moved to the stage of venerable yet, at least not the last time I checked a few days ago. So she's still at the stage of being a a servant of God. So stage number one. Her cause was introduced in 2018. So it's the latest one, which makes sense because she was the last one to die among all these people, of these, all these 6 African-American saints. There are groups that are playing for the canonization of the 6 African-American saints as a group. Again, that's something sort of personal where you want to go with that. Yeah.
Thank you. Carol asks, where does the energy come from to sustain and bring to completion the canonization process from the institutional side, the structure of the Catholic Church or Vatican, or from groups of supporters and researchers? And to what extent are younger generations even aware of this process and importance?
Yeah, well, there are several questions there. Where does the energy come from? Well, remember I said energy and money tend to come from religious congregations. But, in some cases, as in the case of Julia Greeley, is the Diocese of Denver that is supporting her canonization and putting up the money and putting up the energy and etc. Do young people care about this? The cult of saints, and this is another lecture in itself, has changed through the centuries. First, it was only those who had been martyred during the Roman Empire. Then it was people who could be your advocates, who could give you something in exchange. So people prayed to them as they would have a patron who would be the helper to go to the influential person to ask for what you needed, a friend of the minister to get you X. And then during the Middle Ages, they were miracle workers. And that's the reason why people were interested in them. That's the reason why people were interested in going to a certain grave. Remember Chaucer, Canterbury Tales. But in recent years, it's more them as role models. And looking at them as different ways of living a Christian or Catholic life and being a certain kind of person with a certain kind of behavior. And that's what we look up at them as sort of role models for how to be. And John Paul, who canonized left and right, he changed the rules so he could be canonizing people. And the Kenneth Woodward, who writes about the canonization process, said that wherever John Paul went, he had a saint in his pocket. And he really canonized left and right, which means that he spread what it meant to be a saint for more different kinds of people than many previous popes. Part of what he wanted was Catholics from any place in the world to feel that they were represented in heaven, that there was a saint who was like them. And so that was part. So the reasons for canonization have changed. Do those things move young people? I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I taught this course about women saints at San Diego State several times, and I had a full classroom. And I took a tour of students to Europe to look at sites of saints, and they were very much into it, the students who went in that. But now I'm teaching mostly older people, so I'm not sure what the interests are. Okay, more.
Annette asks, who are the leading Black Catholic theologians today?
It's hard to say. Well, I would say Sean Copeland, who is a Black woman, is a theologian, or Brian Massingale might be an interesting person also. Sean Copeland published an anthology that is entitled Unusual Faithfulness or something like that. Yes. And there are a number of people who wrote articles in that publication who are all Black theologians. So, yeah.
Diane asks, were Black women being denied entrance to white orders at the same time that Thea Bowman was accepted into her order? And why was her order open to people of color?
Okay. Number one is historical. The denial of entrance to Black women, it's something from the 19th century, basically. In fact, Catherine Drexel, who created a congregation to work with indigenous and Black people, did not take Black women into her congregation. And there were two reasons. One, she said, I don't want to take away prospective candidates from the two orders of Black women. So I don't want to be competing with them. And two, some of the places where they operated in the South, we're talking end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, Black and white people could not live together. It was illegal. So Black women could not live in convents where they were white women living. When Thea Bowman came, it was already the later part of the 20th century. She was the only woman in her congregation, probably because nobody else thought of going into that particular congregation, not because that particular congregation was saying we don't want Black women. So, you know, historical times change and reasons change. And there are many more. I mean, there are lots of Black women now in the Blessed Sacrament, which is the one Catherine Drexel order. There are a bunch of Black women. The General Superior is actually a Black woman. The Sisters of the Holy Family, the Oblates, and I assume there are more Black sisters in other congregations. There are even Black sisters saying the Sacred Heart, which was supposed to be aristocratic European women. And so there's, you know, there are changes in the historical changes in these kinds of things. Yes. Another one.
Diane also asks, was Augustus Tolton assigned to a Black Catholic parish or an integrated parish? Because this was at a time of tremendous segregation.
At that time, the parishes were completely segregated. And even now, you know, parishes and schools are also segregated because of the neighborhood, depending on the church is and where the people live. Even very, very simple other things that are not even churches. We've been hearing the horrible story about Buffalo. And, you know, it's a supermarket that, you know, tends to or works with Black people. It's just simply the supermarket is there and that's where Black people live. So the church is there and that's where Black people live. So there's fewer active segregation at this point, although there may be other kinds of segregation created by the neighborhoods where people live. There was a time, I mean, and there was one of the articles actually in this anthology that Sean Copeland did that I mentioned before. There's one article talking about a bishop who in the 1950s said, there's not going to be a Black parish and a white parish, there's going to be parishes and everybody goes to all of them. And the white parishioners were up in arms and refused to go to churches with Black people. I had a Black Puerto Rican friend who went to some church, I think in Rhode Island, for Sunday Mass, and no one sat on the bench with him. And I'm talking now, late 80s. So, okay, so things happen regardless, even when the official policy may have changed. Yes. Another question.
That's all that we have so far, but I invite anyone else who has questions or comments to either put them in the chat or to raise your hand so that we can call on you and you can speak them aloud.
Did I see a hand?
Yes, Tanya.
Tanya, yes, okay. On mute.
I cannot tell you how much I appreciated this day.
Oh,
I was so moved, and it was just great to hear all the information that you gave us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. Any other questions, comments, doubts, confusions, disagreements? Anything you can think of? I know that at Mary Magdalene, Susie has, and Malcolm, the director of the musicians, I'll get to Annette's question in a minute. They have a, there's a mass for Thea Bowman. And Susie said the music director was gonna look at it and see if we could use it, but apparently it hasn't been performed anywhere. So whoever tries to do that will have to do it cold, and it's a little scary.
We We haven't been able to find recordings of it, I think
Right, that's it.
is the issue. And yeah,
That's
we hope to introduce it during the summer at Mary Magdalene. So
Yes.
you can follow that either in person or online. And then I think you saw Annette's question of, can you speak to the value of the National Black Sisters Conference today?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a sister, so to begin with, I'm not completely versed on sisters associations, etc. But I imagine, it's still something that it's valuable and important for Black nuns, because there are more Black nuns. And I would suggest also that you look at this book that it's about to come out. I can think of the author's name, the one about Black nuns.
Shannon D. Williams. Shannon D. Williams.
Okay, and it's Duke University Press, and it's Subversive Habits, and it's basically about Black nuns. The other thing is, I mean, there are a number of both men and women, Africans of recent times, that are also in process or recently canonized. And I thought about mentioning them, but then I thought it's going to be too much. So, so I suggest, that book, the Subversive Habits. And yeah. So Corey is saying, you can find the book on Amazon and Duke University Press. And as I said before, you can find all my books on Amazon, and the one on saints is there, and it's now a paperback, and there's also an ebook, Kindle edition, or whatever they do with this. So there's more coming out about that, but I cannot really answer Annette's question, because I'm not 100% sure that I know what this Black Sisters Association means for Black nuns at this point. I suppose it's still relevant, but again, I don't really know enough about it. So anybody else? We will. I'd love to get a copy of the chat, Corey, because
sure thing. I can make sure that happens.
Okay. Anybody else who wants to say anything? And thank to all of you who are sending notes saying thank you. I appreciate that. When you're talking, you never know if people at the other end are getting anything, or you're just yakking by yourself about what interests you. So I'm glad to know that you have found it interesting and informative and meaningful and etc. So glad to know. And I want to remind you that you can give donations to Mary Magdalene for this effort. This is a little plug on the side. So please remember that. Okay. So if there are no more questions, we have officially 5 more minutes, but I think if there's nothing else, I'll just say goodbye and hope to see you again the next time I do a presentation.
And we have our closing song. Oliva, don't forget.
We now have Thea Bowman again for the closing song. So don't go away, listen to her before you go away. Okay, see you all. Bye-bye.
And on behalf of Mary Magdalene, I'd like to add my thanks to Oliva for all of you for joining us. If you'd like to support our community, you can do so at mmacc.org/donate. And here is Thea Bowman with Go Tell It on the Mountain.
Why don't you
Go tell it on the mountain, tell it over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is Lord. Oh, shepherds feared and trembled when low upon the earth rang out the angels' chorus that hailed our Savior's birth.
why don't you
Oh, tell it on the mountain, tell it over the hills and everywhere. Oh, tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is Lord. Down in a lowly manger, the humble Christ was born, and God sent down salvation that blessed Christmas morn.
why don't you
Why don't you tell it on the mountain, tell it over the hills and everywhere. Tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is Lord.
He made me a watchman up on the city wall. And if I am a Christian, I am the least of all.
why don't you
Why don't you tell it on the mountain, tell it over the hills and everywhere. Tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is Lord. Now when I was a sinner, I sought both night and day. I asked the Lord to help me, and He showed
Thank you all for joining us.